In the early months of 2024, the world was baffled by images of a two-story house with a white picket fence floating in the middle of San Francisco Bay. At first glance, the situation seemed improbable, yet this house is part of an unusual series of full-sized, intact buildings being moved from their original location in the Bay Area, and sometimes, though rarely, by floating across it. So, what are the bizarre circumstances behind these events, and why does this continue happening in the modern day? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the story of San Francisco's floating houses. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. For context, the story of San Francisco's architecture really begins with the Gold Rush, a fever that transformed the otherwise sleepy outpost of just 1,000 people into a chaotic metropolis of 25,000, and all of that within a single year. This so-called instant city demanded immediate housing, but there was a problem, as the region lacked things like brick kilns and the stone quarries of back east. Hence, to resolve the issue, builders looked to the north, where they found a wealth of rot-resistant, lightweight, old-growth redwood and began harvesting vast amounts. Using this timber, they embraced the balloon frame construction concept, a revolutionary method of using light, pre-cut lumber that allowed for grand homes to be assembled almost like kits. With that, the city rose. By the late 1800s, the wooden skeletons were dressed in the high fashion of the Victorian era. Remember, this was an age obsessed with social status, leading to the creation of things like the painted ladies, whimsical, ornate structures decorated with mass-produced gingerbread-like trim, though this style also served a practical function. Basically, due to the city's steep hills and narrow lots, architects designed these homes to be tall and thin, in fitting with the geography. Though, to preserve the illusion of space, they used things like iconic bay windows to pull light and views into the home, which was otherwise little more than a long and narrow floor plan. So things looked good. But then, just when it seemed that the city had a system for sustainable growth, it faced an era known as the Great Disruption. And I might add here that the catalyst for this all was a moment of absolute catastrophe. That's right, we're talking about an earthquake. On April the 18th, 1906, the earth shook. Then the city ignited. And the resulting fire is really what did the damage here. As remember, San Francisco was basically an untamed woodpile of chopped redwood. So the resulting fire burned for over 3 days, consuming 28,000 buildings. When the smoke finally cleared, the city was split in two. There was the burn zone, a wasteland of charred brick, and then you had the survivor zone, where thousands of Victorian homes actually still stood untouched. Though their fate was also hanging in the wind, as in the panic of the aftermath, the city expanded its fire limits, meaning with the stroke of a pen, those grand Victorian homes that survived the flames basically became legally obsolete. And as you might imagine, this created a unique crisis for homeowners. Furthermore, the land in the city's core was now seen as incredibly valuable for a modernizing skyline. A skyline that the redwood homes, magnificent as they were, no longer fit into. Thus, many owners concluded that they were essentially holding a movable asset. And I want to be clear about this here. This wasn't the first, nor would it be the last time in history that homeowners would come to such a conclusion. In fact, long before San Francisco ever moved a single home, cities around the world had already proven that buildings didn't have to die where they stood. For example, in the early 1800s, engineers in London dismantled and relocated the original London Bridge. And they did so to make way for a new crossing. And a side fact here, that original bridge actually ended up in Arizona of all places. We did a video on it years ago. Anyhow, my list goes on. In downtown Chicago, engineers chose not to demolish the Indiana Bell Telephone Building, which was a 7-story steel-framed skyscraper standing directly in the path of a brand new roadway. And since no one wanted to demolish this building, they just up and moved it. I'd also like to mention an example that would come much later. in 1970, when planners chose not to demolish this palace. Rather, as you can see, they built tracks, jacked the building up, and simply wheeled it to its new position. And in doing so, they managed to save the whole structure. And the amazing thing is that until very recently, engineers were able to plan these unusual yet monumental moves using little more than their own intelligence. A notion that I'd suggest reflects the values of our friends and sponsor, Supernote. I'm sure that some of you guys have noticed this beautiful tablet that I've been working with recently. Well, it's the type of tool that I have been dreaming about for years now, since it's built purely for activities that require deep thinking. Things like script writing, drawing, or simply taking notes. Supernote cuts out the most harmful aspects of technology while providing a beneficial alternative. Meaning you can do things like get your files off Dropbox, but you won't have to look at any social media along the way. In fact, I used the tool to write this entire episode, as my daughter used it to provide those stunning visuals, some of which you've already seen and some of which we'll show in a moment. Hence, I'm getting back to the basics in my life. No more AI slop and no more brain rot. I'm going to be writing on a tool that is best suited for capturing what's in my imagination and my curiosity. I'm pretty sure that most of you will come to the same type of conclusion. It's only a matter of time. But if you are ready to simplify and support a company embracing the timeless ancient philosophies that we now call deep thinking, consider treating yourself to this fantastic device by clicking my link in the description below. Thank you, Supernote, for supporting the channel and helping me get back my peace of mind. Otherwise, let's get back to the story. So as you can see, in some regards, buildings always have been and always will be movable. Back in San Francisco, citizens decided to embrace that notion. This made a lot of sense. Instead of demolishing their homes, it was more profitable to just pick up the entire house and roll it to a residential neighborhood where wood was still permitted. Fortunately, the city was also on board with this concept, since the fire had already left 250,000 people homeless, and the last thing that city authorities wanted was to remove yet more real estate from the area. In fact, in addition to salvaging the Victorians, the city also wanted to save thousands of tiny green so-called earthquake shacks. These were temporary homes in public parks to house refugees. So once the emergency passed, the city offered a deal. Residents could keep the shacks, but only if they hauled them away themselves. In other words, in the many decades to come, thousands of homes, shacks, or even public buildings would move across the city, and sometimes across the bay. And it's safe to say that the prototype for the audacity to come was actually a public structure known as the Ohio Building. Standing as a grand exhibit of the 1915 World's Fair, it was never meant to last. But when the fair ended, a group of investors saw a bargain that they couldn't refuse. In short, they bought this massive structure for just $1,000 and planned to move it. According to some sources, to save it, engineers built a massive timber cradle beneath its joints. And from there, they waited for a king tide, the month's highest water level, to float a giant barge directly beneath the building's foundation. Then, as the tide receded, the ocean itself accepted the weight of the building. This was a brilliant solution, as with a single tugboat, they did what a team of 50 horses could never really achieve on land. They turned a state house into a ship. And although the move turned out to be a success, this structure would not pass the test of time, as today, nothing of it remains. Regardless, it's important to point out that while the bay provided a water highway for some, most of San Francisco's architectural moves still had to navigate the city's notoriously steep and narrow streets. Such was the case with the Newton J. Thorpe Commercial School, this massive 3-story brick structure, which some sources speculate weighed up to 8,000 tons. Yet it was standing in the way of the city's grand vision for a new civic center, so they chose to move it. And as you can see, the engineers didn't just lift the whole building, they actually had to sever it from the foundation and place it on a grid of enormous steel beams and timber rollers. And once everything was ready, the enormous operation moved inch by inch across the city. Arguably, the biggest challenge came when it had to be rotated 90 degrees in the middle of a city intersection. For several weeks, the school slowly traversed San Francisco as many other wooden structures were making similar journeys. But it was important, as this move's success proved that even brick and mortar could conquer the land. But that wouldn't always remain the case. As San Francisco modernized, the street became a tangled web of overhead electric trolley lines and utility poles, meaning that the window to move buildings on land was rapidly closing. Bringing us to what I perceive as one of the most dramatic images of our story: the rescue of the Lyford House, a building designed by a man every bit as eerie as the architecture he would one day leave behind. Dr. Benjamin Lyford was far from your average Victorian gentleman. A veteran Civil War surgeon, he spent years perfecting the grisly science of embalming. That's right, he was a pioneer in the art of chemical preservation of the dead. And apparently, his obsession with stopping decay was also metaphorically applied to his views on social structures. And his ideas were a bit controversial. Basically, he was obsessed with hygiene and utopian ideals. He married Hilarita Reed, the heiress to a massive ranch, where together they built this Victorian masterpiece in 1876 at Strawberry Point. For the doctor, this house was the symbol of a healthy future, complete with that beautiful 19th century trim, of course. However, the concept would prove to be entirely out of step with the real world, since by the 1950s, Lyford's utopia was being overtaken by the post-war suburban boom, with Strawberry Point specifically subdivided for modern luxury housing. Hence, the Lyford House, once the jewel of the peninsula, was now a little more than an obstacle on a construction site. That's right, the house was slated for demolition to make way for a new development. But then, things took a twist when a local woman named Rosie Vernell intervened, offering to donate her nearby pasture to the National Abduction Society on the condition that the house be moved there to serve as a sanctuary. And here's the thing, it might have actually been more reasonable to simply build a replica of the house, since moving it proved to be almost impossible. Remember, the narrow winding roads of the county were never built for a Victorian mansion to move through, hence land transit was now impossible, forcing movers to turn back to the seafaring tradition established by the Ohio Building 40 years prior. And so it was. In December of 1957, they lifted the entire structure onto a massive barge and waited for the tide. Then, when the moment was right, a tugboat pulled the mansion across the bay, resulting in an event that would become one of the most iconic images in California history. By the 1970s, the city's west side was being carved up to make way for modern housing and highways, meaning hundreds of historic homes were set to be demolished, but a few would be saved, as a group of activists drew their line in the sand. The most inspiring example of this occurred in November of 1974, during one of the most logistically dense operations in the city's history, as 12 Victorian houses were moved simultaneously, where they were huddled together for safety. The spectacle was so grand that it was described as a herd of elephants navigating the city. But then, after the 1970s, a few houses were moved over the next 50 years. In fact, the next one happened in February of 2021, when a 139-year-old Victorian mansion, the Englander House, rolled down Franklin Street. And it was done so at the staggering cost of nearly $500,000. Additionally, the city had to temporarily remove items such as parking meters, street lights, and even trim decade-old trees to make this move possible. But the 2021 case was rather important, as it proved that even in the modern day, Californians love those balloon-framed houses enough to preserve them whenever possible. So what about that floating house with the picket fence that we talked about in the intro? Well, although it might look like a historic home, this particular house has always been on the water. It was a resident of Docktown, a decades-old floating home community in Redwood City, and its journey was an eviction of sorts. The consensus suggests that the owner was a retired resident that had lived in the home for many years, though he was asked to move his house as the city was pushing homes off public waterways. Apparently, the owner fought for years to try and stay in that location, but eventually accepted a settlement to move, And this is where things went wrong. You see, towing a floating home through a waterway as windy and unpredictable as the bay is a highly challenging operation, since the top-heavy design of those homes act like a giant sail. And this is precisely why the mission nearly ended in disaster when the house was caught in a brutal combination of high winds and shifting currents. And as the elements intensified, the structure began to lean precariously, meaning the tugboat was forced to abandon the transit for its own safety, leaving the house anchored and seemingly adrift in the open water for 2 days. The recovery required a precision recapture during a narrow window of glass-calm weather. This is when the movers were able to secure the house and navigate the treacherous passage beneath the Richardson Bay Bridge, with apparently only inches of clearance. Though I'm happy to report that in the end, the home arrived to its new location safely. So, as you can probably see, in San Francisco, people will go to extreme lengths to preserve historic architecture, though I do have to wonder about future generations and if they'll make the same efforts, especially when it comes to protecting buildings that are modern now. Somehow, it's hard for me to imagine that buildings of our time will ever have that kind of sentimental value. Although, perhaps I'm wrong, and if I am, please let me know in the comments section below. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.